Well, hello and good day to everyone joining us from all across the world. On behalf of the Academy, I am Praveen Chopra, and it is my privilege to welcome you to yet another episode of Conversations with the Academy. Well into its third year, the global COVID-19 pandemic continues making demands on researchers, policymakers, and governments to change traditional mindsets and address multiple dimensions which go far beyond the implication of the pandemic itself. Can I have the next slide, Kit? The favorable outcome with the accelerated development of vaccines and the pragmatic utilization of the emergency use authorization instrument has triggered an increasingly empowered patient and advocacy voice for access to investigational treatments and biopharmaceutical innovation. This has also drawn attention to revisiting some of the traditional tenets with future approvals of new drugs and the likely longer-term implications for medicine's development paradigms and for novel clinical trial design considerations. We have witnessed that it is feasible for traditional industry rivals to collaborate to deliver with global data sharing and greater transparency without impeding intellectual property. It is doable for regulators and the industry to engage in early dialogue and rolling reviews with elements of expedited review and approval. It is foreseeable that this intensified efforts be taken by all stakeholders to accelerate innovation cycles and bring scientific breakthroughs faster to patients across the world who are questioning, where is my Operation Warp Speed? But are these levels of enormous government spending, resource utilization, and de-risk critical decision-making sustainable? Are regulatory allowances and process modulation potentially compromising scientific tenets and patient safety over speed? What is the optimal balance between therapeutic area investment vis-a-vis deprioritization of other diseases? Now, to guide us through this plethora of emerging scenarios, we are indeed fortunate to have a formidable faculty sharing their insights and expertise with us. But before we go there, before we launch into the discussion, let me have a few notes on the sessions today. We will follow our usual conversational format. We have already over 180 registrants today, and the audience is already ready to challenge the faculty with questions in the Q&A box, and you can do that in real time in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And look out for the poll question as well. And do keep in mind that the session is being recorded. It's to be made available for on-demand viewing on the Academy website later on. Next slide, Kit. And now, allow me the privilege of introducing Dr. Kenneth Caton and Dr. Paul Vandenbroek, driving today's deliberations. Dr. Caton is Professor of Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston and a Senior Fellow at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. He previously served as the group's director for over 20 years. And in addition, he's an advisory professor at Shanghai Medical College at Fudan University. And he also serves on the faculties of drug development programs at the University of Basel and the University of California. Internationally recognized with commendation and awards for his contributions for drug policy and drug development policy and sciences, Dr. Caton has provided public testimony before the US Congress and has been president of the DIA, editor-in-chief of the Expert Review of Clinical Pharmacology, and in his spare time, a consultant to the US Department of Defense on bioterror countermeasures. Presently, Dr. Caton consults and presents on global trends in pharmaceutical development and regulation. Returning to our platform is Dr. Vandenbroek, who is Chief Medical Officer with Pfizer's Hospital Business Unit and has devoted decades spearheading clinical development, medical strategy, and medical affairs while on leadership assignments with Pfizer across the globe. He's on the boards of the American Federation for Aging Research and the World Demographic and Aging Forum, and on the advisory board of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics. He has championed the development of therapeutic solutions and health policy issues with particular emphasis for diseases of the developing world. His advocacy of the patient's cause by a judicious balance of science and ethics with refined business practices is afforded by his medical grounding, augmented by advanced training in business administration and pharmaceutical medicine. From driving Pfizer's flagship international clinical development program for Lipitor, through his senior medical and regulatory roles based in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, Dr. Vandenbroek brings a truly global cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic perspective to his interactions. With their extensive span of expertise intersecting with basic science, biopharmaceutical research, and entrepreneurship, Dr. Caton and Dr. Vandenbroek are uniquely positioned to opine on today's critical discourse. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you very much, Pravin. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in. I'm going to share my slides now. And just give a few introductory comments that I think will help set the stage for the discussion that we're going to have right now. Can you all see my slide?
It's taking off.
Good. So I just have 8 or 9 slides, and it's really just to set the stage for this important discussion that we're going to be having to look at what drug development is going to look like in the post-COVID world. So some of you might be thinking, are we really in the post-COVID world? Aren't we still in the COVID world? This is a good time to look at what drug development is going to look like in the post-COVID world. And as I said before, some of you may question whether this is really the time to look at post-COVID, because we're still, in many respects, still in the middle of in the early stages or the late stages of the pandemic. But the fact of the matter is hospitalizations and deaths are declining from COVID-19. And it's a good time to start asking what's next. Even though we may see more cases in certain areas of the world, in certain regions, an increase in infections, the fact of the matter is deaths and hospitalizations are declining in large part because of the availability of highly effective vaccines and therapeutics that were developed over the last 2 years, as well as the fact that the new variants of the virus, the Omicron variant, for example, is associated with less severe reactions and is less deadly. But this is a good time now to start to consider what lessons have we learned from COVID and how is it going to affect drug development going forward. So I'm just going to repeat a slide that I showed in my lecture. You may remember this from my lecture all the way back in January. This is a composite slide of the time, cost, and risk of drug development, just to remind you of the difficulties and challenges of bringing new pharmaceutical products to market. In the upper left, you see timelines on average about 7.5 years of clinical development time, with a variability of over 9 years for gastrointestinal products of clinical development, down to about 6.3 years for anti-infective products. Still a very long time to bring new products through clinical development. And then the average FDA approval time is in the small bar at the end of each of those bars. And you can see that it's a long time just from the start of clinical testing. Similarly, success rates show differences across different therapeutic areas, with an average of about 12%. In other words, about 88% of candidates that start clinical testing will fail at some point in development. And we see variability of anti-infectives having about 24% success rate, but a shockingly low success rate in the central nervous system and cardiovascular areas of 6.2% and 3.7% respectively. All of it to suggest that in some areas where there's very significant medical need, the overall likelihood of success is astoundingly low. And make no mistake about it, when you see these low kinds of success rates, what that means is that there are disincentives for companies to develop products in these areas. I mean, why invest the R&D dollars to try to bring a drug to market when the likelihood of failure could be, for example, in the cardiovascular space, close to 94%. Overall, long timelines and high degrees of failure or risk translated to the high cost of drug development. And the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development is probably best known for its studies on the cost of drug development. And our most recent study that was published in 2016 showed that it cost $2.6 billion to bring one successful new drug to the marketplace. This is a fully capitalized cost, and it includes the cost of failures. I might mention that we're in the process of updating that figure and hope to have that out before the end of the year, so we can update the overall cost figure. These are studies that result in a figure based on actual cost data provided by companies, and they're used internationally to assess the overall likelihood, the overall cost of bringing a new product to market. So now we look at COVID-19 and look at some of the features of the response to the pandemic And we can ask how much of this is permanent, how much of it is not permanent, what is going to move forward, what's going to permanently affect drug development going forward into the future. So what we saw is, as Pravin mentioned early on, we saw an unprecedented level of global cooperation in scientific researchers, clinical investigators, small pharma companies, large pharma companies, all of these government institutions, all of them working together, sharing data in an effort to generate enough information to start develop new therapeutics and vaccines. I think the results of that are evident. We had 3 viable vaccines within a very short period of time, relatively speaking, about 10 months, as well as a tremendous amount of data and analysis to develop new therapeutics. Now, it didn't take long for there to be questions about the reliability and the validity of some of the results that were being tested, whether being posted, whether some of the published data are of a high enough quality to warrant being put out in the public arena. I would suggest that what we see here is part of a guidebook for responding to a pandemic, to try to mobilize all of these various forces, get them together to try to generate enough data to stimulate a tremendous amount of activity to find therapeutics and vaccines to deal with the disease. Is this a long-term approach? I would suspect not, just because the industry is competitive and that's not the way drug development has occurred in the past. And I don't think it's going to change dramatically in the future unless there's another medical emergency. What about the integration of some of these powerful tools that we hear about so much? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing. Well, this is something that is not new. The industry is trying to incorporate this for many years. But I think at the end of the day, what we may see is that the pandemic has catalyzed this process. Artificial intelligence in all of its various forms allows for improvements in the drug development process from the discovery phase, which might look at as being able to scan combinatorial libraries and other company collections of compounds that are not currently in development to determine whether they're potential candidates for further development in another area, all the way to clinical development and past that. In the clinical development world, the use of artificial intelligence and especially natural language processing might include the use of electronic health records, something that has been very difficult for industry to really use because of how it's collected and how it's processed. This is something that could really be a tremendous game changer, I think, in the future. And I suspect that this is something we're going to see moving forward. And the part that I want to talk a little bit more about now is how the pandemic has led to new clinical trial designs. What we began to see very early on is that as the clinical trials started to slow up and sites began to stop doing their trials because of the pandemic, we began to see the introduction of these decentralized, remote, or hybrid trials where patients and participants didn't actually have to come into the clinics. They could actually be participants while participating at home. And this was enabled by the introduction of a lot of new technologies like telemedicine and wearables that allowed for the collection of valuable data from patients when they were at remote locations. So just to review, this is from data that this Tufts Center collected early on in the pandemic, looking at the first few months. And as you know, thousands of clinical trials were either halted or suspended as a result of COVID in the early days. And you could see that for those that continued, only about 45% continued along their original plan of having patients coming into a clinic. 25%, a quarter of all clinical trials, were suspended or delayed. But 30% of them continued with remote and virtual support. In other words, these decentralized trials. So as we considered this movement, decentralized trials, this suddenly became something that was very, patients enjoyed it, physicians enjoyed it. They preferred having this kind of design where patients didn't have to come into the clinic. They didn't have to dedicate sites specifically to having patients coming in at a regular interval. And it was actually noted in a number of different venues, including even the New York Times in the United States, where they had an article that said clinical trials are moving out of the lab and into people's homes. In other words, acknowledging the fact that we're moving to an era where patients who want to participate in a clinical trial don't have to go to a clinic. They can actually participate while they are at home. Now, as you can imagine, there are challenges and there are opportunities and advantages for doing these trials, but this leads to our first poll question. And that is, in your opinion, and some of you probably have experience with decentralized trials, and some of you may have read about them or know about them, there are clearly challenges associated with these trials. So in your opinion, we'll give you a moment to respond to this. What would be the most significant challenge for investigators conducting these types of trials? Is it the training of the investigators in the sites? Is it recruitment of patients? Is it the use of validated measurement tools and devices? Is it medication adherence and patient safety? Is it general oversight of the trial, or is it regulatory acceptance of real-world data? I'll give you a moment to respond.
Thank you, Ken. And while the audience is thinking about this, it might be helpful to throw some light from your perspectives on the global level of decentralization and what's feasible, because there are challenges in some of the low and middle income countries as well. So it might be helpful to focus on some light on that and what your thoughts on that would be. And we'll also check with Paul on his interpretation of that.
Absolutely. It's a very good point.
So Kit, I guess we have the answer. There we go. Ken.
Great. Medication adherence. Well, there's no real right answer to this question. I mean, all of these represent challenges, and medication adherence and patient safety, I combine the two of them, but they actually are quite different things. Let me go to the next slide and we could follow up on some of this. Interesting that many of you said regulatory acceptance of real world data. As you know, that's a work in progress, both within the FDA and the EU and in other regions of the world, to try the best way to validate, manage, and utilize real world evidence and data. There are guidances on this by the FDA, but this is still something that I think is a work in progress. So let me close this, and I just have two more slides. And so let me give you what I consider some of the decentralized clinical trial advantages and challenges. From the advantages side, we definitely see time and cost savings. These are some follow-up studies that were done by the Tufts Center that have actually shown that many of these clinical trials are done faster and at a cost savings relative to the standard type of trials where the patients were required to come into the clinic at a regular interval to collect data. There's faster access to data. If you have a patient that's on a medication and suddenly there's a response to that medication while they're at home, you get access to that immediately if they're using wearables or if there's some sort of remote way of accessing the data, as opposed to waiting until the next time they enter the clinic. There's patient enthusiasm, participant enthusiasm, engagement, and retention. Uniformly, participants in clinical trials have said they prefer this type of arrangement, the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, but do it from the comforts of their own home. There's an opportunity to collect robust real-world evidence and data. There's a broad array of available technologies that enable some of these trials that many of these didn't exist in the past. There's, very importantly, an increased diversity and minority representation opportunity in these clinical trials. You don't have to have a site in an area in a region where there's a population that typically does not participate in clinical trials. If this is a remote trial, you can have the site based in New York City, but participants in that trial that are based in any part of the country or even the world for that matter. So there's an opportunity to increase diversity and minority representation in clinical trials, very importantly. And patient participant safety. The fact of the matter is they don't have to come into a clinic. They don't have to expose themselves to whatever is going on in the hospital, and they don't even have to get into their car to drive to the hospital. So there's a safety aspect to that as well. But what about the challenges? Well, I repeat, participant safety. Because now, if there's a safety problem or if something happens, they're at home. They're not in the clinic. They may not be picked up as quickly. Adherence is definitely an issue. You don't know whether the patients are actually taking the medication. And this has led to all sorts of discussions and opportunities for organizations that try to manage patient adherence through different technologies. And I think that this is something that will gain traction as we move forward. And then the trial management itself, the data reliability, integrity, and quality. You don't know how a lot of this data is being collected. The compatibility of solutions with IT systems. If you're using different wearables or different technologies to collect data, you don't know how much that will be compatible with your internal ID systems within your hospital. And then the site investigator training and technical capabilities. Not everybody knows how to do these trials. Not all sites are familiar with the approaches. So this is all that I'm going to talk about decentralized trials now. I'm just going to add one last slide.
Before we go there, Ken, can we address a question that's coming up and also the issue around in the last slide? How are we looking at, one of the benefits of globalization and the data utilization, data sharing is the large, more countries being involved and being able to gather data across the board. What do you see that as a challenge? Because some countries or some areas may lend themselves to the operationalizing of decentralized trials, some therapeutic areas, but may not be all. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we're definitely seeing this movement worldwide, and not in some of the perhaps low and middle income countries, but we're definitely seeing it worldwide. There's an interest in these. The issue is sharing information, and the last slide that I have here may address some of those issues. These are not directly related, but they may be somewhat related to decentralized trials issues. And these are just some other topics that I thought maybe we could address over the course of this discussion. And I'll bring your attention to the second item here, that it accelerates the adoption of enhanced clinical trial designs. And one of them is a platform design, for example, where you collect why do we do different control groups every time we're studying a drug? Why don't we have patient databases that include data from patients with a particular disease state, which we can collect from all over the world? We don't have to just look at one country. There is a lot of opportunity to start to accelerate the adoption of some of these approaches to speed the drug development process and improve the overall efficiency and productivity of clinical trials. And I think that's something that we're definitely going to move into. Let me just finish this slide and then we can have a more general discussion. Going back to the first item, I think that looking at a post-COVID world, we may be catalyzing patient engagement and diversity initiatives. I don't think we've ever had a time where patients, the public in general, was more aware of some of the aspects of drug development. You could get individuals within any area of many regions of the world that could talk in an educated fashion about phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials. I mean, that just it doesn't normally exist. So we might take advantage of that there's more patient engagement, and there's more interest from a diversity perspective. There's an increased interest in drug repurposing, looking at what's out there. Now, this is not new, but this may be catalyzed by the pandemic as we look more and more at compounds that are sitting on in company libraries that could be used for different indications. What about expanded early access and regulatory fast track tools? Most regulatory agencies have at their disposal different approaches to giving early access to drugs. This is something that we can look at more closely going forward, especially when dealing with a life-threatening or severely debilitating diseases. What about global market access and affordability? I would hope that the pandemic, if nothing else, tells us that we have to consider making drugs available and the affordability of those drugs in all regions of the world, not just the industrialized countries of Europe, Northern Europe, and the United States. or the assessment of global initiatives. Pravin mentioned in his opening comments, Operation Warp Speed. Was that effective? Was that designed in the best way possible to stimulate innovation within many of the pharmaceutical companies? This is something that, at least for a roadmap for future response to pandemics, we should have a better understanding about what's the best way to organize government initiatives to stimulate innovation. And then finally, the expansion of new research technologies into areas of high unmet medical need. There was so much attention paid to mRNA and its utilization for a COVID vaccine, but what's the utilization of some of these new technologies for diseases that have been around for a long time that don't have treatments? Malaria, type 2 diabetes, a host of other unmet medical needs where perhaps they could benefit from some of these technologies that we began to see used for the treatment of and the vaccination for COVID-19. So there's a lot of opportunity going forward. I'm excited about the future for pharmaceutical R&D, and I think that we can start the discussion now and look at how some of these things will actually manifest themselves. So Pravin, now I'll turn it back to you and start what's going on.
No, thank you, Ken. I think you've set the ball rolling about some of the elements that are sustainable, some which are not. And let's start off with the question we are triggering in, but the question around, we raised about whether this is doable from a global setting. Paul, you've been involved in the CIOM's effort around clinical research in resource-limited settings, and you've also had experiences in other markets. Would you be able to comment or give your thoughts on how do you see this panning out from a global implementation of the decentralized clinical trial process?
Sure, and happy to do that, Pravin. But before I do that, I'd like to make a couple of points as well, so that we have a fuller discussion. And so Ken is right. There's been a tremendous amount of learning in different fields, actually, related to the pandemic. And so we, and a lot of these things actually were perhaps already in evolution, but the pandemic has really accelerated that evolution. And so we're, in a certain sense, into a new era where we can really rethink clinical development and how we can go about it. And there's many advantages to this. There's a few pitfalls as well, of course. It's not limited to clinical development. Ken mentioned the messenger RNA technology. For years, we wanted to use mRNA technology for a particular vaccine. And actually, COVID-19 gave us the opportunity to do this and to do this at scale. And so now that has basically validated the technology. And now we can apply messenger RNA to many infectious diseases. And actually, a lot of companies around the world are already working on this furiously, I might add. The other thing that I think from a technical perspective, decentralized clinical trials have really come to the fore. And I would say also similarly, decentralized clinical trials have been around for a while. In 2011, Pfizer ran a randomized controlled trial in overactive bladder called Remote, for instance. And so it's just great to see how COVID-19 really brings this to the fore again, and how we will be doing this. And I would really want to focus on the fact that decentralized trials are not synonymous with real-world evidence or real-world data. They can be used if properly managed and run. They can be used for randomized controlled trials. And so that's, I think, also a great development, together with the platform trials and some other forms of clinical development. So there's been some great learnings there. They have also been underpinned actually by the exceptional circumstances in which we have found ourselves with COVID-19, and that really has helped us evolve much faster than we otherwise would. And it's important when we look to the future in applying these learnings that we understand the circumstances in which these developments took place. And so just a couple of things that I would like to mention is that the industry really focused all their resources for those companies that had development on a particular development, and we should not underestimate the importance of this when a company really focuses. It's not that we literally dropped everything, but we came quite close to drop everything else. And so what the effect can be when a company really devotes all of its resources to develop a vaccine or a drug or anything else for a particular disease. This focus, I think, was a very important element as well in this. And the second one also is the regulatory attention to this and the regulatory, for lack of a better word, availability. Because, you know, companies like Pfizer and other major pharma companies have a number of clinical development projects ongoing. I believe at last count, we had around 100 as a company. And so regulators divide their time between those different development programs. And so here, of course, the regulatory attention was really focused very clearly on solving the COVID-19 problem. So I think that is a lesson also for us as to prioritizing also from a public health perspective. Where do we put as a country or as a or globally, where do we really put our attention, and how can we work together to achieve this between government, academia, and industry? Particular attention, of course, the regulatory mechanism of EUA is a very important mechanism that can be applied going forward as well. And then a last point in that is the way investment was managed in this. So investment both from a government perspective with the Warp Speed program, but also from a company perspective, has been very much put in at risk. And so we've seen several companies, including in India, for instance, put up significant amounts of money in clinical development and also in manufacturing to bring either a vaccine or a drug as soon as possible to solve or to help solve the problem of COVID-19. So I think these are more overall structural and strategic lessons, which actually also then go into what we've learned from the importance of infectious disease. So COVID-19 really has focused the attention again on infectious disease because we've seen what a world with infectious disease run amok would look like, and that also has focused the attention again on the way in which antimicrobial resistance, for instance, has really increased over the past few decades. And we have actually, in spite of the 24% success rate for clinical development, we have actually seen very few new antibiotics developed. And hopefully we'll get an increased focus on this. The commercial model for development of antibiotics is clearly broken because even with a clinical success rate of 24%, we have very few drugs that are being developed. And the other big strategic issue in which we should see the new clinical models, I think, is the importance of pandemic preparedness. With climate change, the risk of new pandemics is definitely increasing, also because of an increasing population worldwide, and the increasing proportion of that population that is a vulnerable older population as well. So these are things to think about perhaps in a broader, more strategic context, but they also drive the development of new clinical models. Now, a couple of caveats, and perhaps the most important one is, as we look at those models, we should keep the example of hydroxychloroquine and Didier Raoult in mind. So we really need, as we develop and as we promote these new models, we really need to put very clear boundaries and very clear criteria around this, so that the data that is produced in these new models is data that we can rely on to make decisions for the health and welfare of the patient. And so it's a work in progress, and it really requires academia, clinical investigators, industry, and regulatory agencies, and also policymakers that put the overall health priorities to work together in order to then lead to what we all hope will be a much faster and a much better development of solutions for patients. So thanks, Praveen, over to you.
No, thank you, Paul. I think you brought in a very important perspective around the partners, the industry, and also the preparedness for the pandemic. So maybe let's trigger off the next session with the poll question with the audience and see what their pulse is about the preparedness that you just alluded to. And maybe we'll come back to this topic because it brings in a host of series, particularly with the illusion of speed, maybe compromising safety. So we'll come back there in a second. So here's a poll question for the audience, and it triggers many of the points you just alluded to, Paul, about how does not just the industry, I guess, but the industry is spearheading the role in another pandemic response. So give them a few minutes to ponder over this, and we'll come back to the answer. And Paul, you touched very nicely around the issue of prioritization, and the question also comes up is, where is the investment going to go? Are we deprioritizing some real world issues which Ken also alluded to, and how does the industry help keep the focus on and not dissipate that with the several new challenges on the table? So Kit, do we have the response to the poll? There we go. Paul, thoughts on this?
Yeah, so clearly the and it's very gratifying to see these responses. That clearly the emphasis is on collaboration, working together across some of the players that I just mentioned, and I fully agree with the answers at the bottom. It would be, I think, a mistake for pharmaceutical companies to drop all development in other areas if we have a new pandemic that would be detrimental to the patient. And we've seen also, of course, the effect of COVID-19 in general has been that a lot of patients that had chronic treatments, like oncology patients, for instance, have been affected by the fact that some of the healthcare system was solely focused on COVID-19, or was basically closed in the early part of the pandemic to any other disease but COVID-19. And definitely, I don't think industry should go it alone. This needs to be done in a wider framework.
Again, your reflections from the investment of the public sector side, because there is a responsibility and accountability. There was a heavy investment from the governments, and is this sustainable going forward? You've also seen the public sector stepping up in other markets, the emerging market sector. What are your thoughts around building on that collaboration based on the learnings in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think from my personal view, I think it's less a question of money. I think it is more a question of providing the right conditions for these different actors to work together and to bring out the best. I think financial investment, at least in drug development or vaccine development, I think is less important than creating the overall framework and the overall regulatory framework and prioritization together with industry. I think that is important rather than and I think also for Operation Warp Speed, I think the financial investment might have been important for certain individual companies, but actually overall, I'm not sure that has been the major factor in the successful development.
Ken, your thoughts?
There's definitely been a trend over the last 20 years or so for pharmaceutical companies, especially the larger companies, to offload some of the early discovery research aspects of drug development. I mean, the days where a large pharma company took great pride in being able to take a compound from the laboratory bench to the clinic is gone. No company would take pride in that anymore. It would look inefficient. At the same time, as public funding has dried up, academic institutions and other public research organizations have become more dependent on industry funding to do some of their research activities. So there's a pretty good symbiosis going on right now between the public and the private sectors in terms of academic research, and that transitioning into applied research. My only concern, and I've expressed this at various times in the past, is that all of this leaves out basic research. And the fact of the matter is, we can look at some of the basic research that already exists and look for ways to make it more amenable to applied research and commercial development. But without new understanding of disease process, we're still behind the 8 ball here. We have to understand how these diseases operate. Areas like Alzheimer's disease, which we really don't understand whether there are different variants of Alzheimer's disease. We don't know how to really treat Alzheimer's disease. The various approaches we've got now are focusing on plaques, which may or may not be the best way to approach this. Basic research is the answer, but if we're looking at only translational research or research that's funded by industry within academia, that's not going to give us those answers. We rely on public funders like the NIH in the United States and other organizations around the world to ensure that we continue to have a body of basic research data so that we can understand the diseases before we find the ways to treat those diseases. So it's sort of a positive negative here. And I'm a little concerned about how many academic research institutions that I'm familiar with have moved away from doing basic research because there's just no money there for it.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you, Ken. A basic research needs to be funded independently and independently from industry, because a lot of the discoveries that are made in basic research, which is basically the search for knowledge's sake, right, has benefits that one cannot envisage up front, right? And so a lot of serendipitous discoveries that really come out of that basic research and really helps our basic understanding. And in the case of Alzheimer's, look, as an industry, we've blown $100 billion on a mechanism that has yet to show a positive outcome. So in Alzheimer's, especially, the need for basic research is definitely very important, and there's definitely a role for government there to present. What I was talking about, of course, was things like in pandemic responses, pandemic preparedness, the warp speed and investment in drug development. And it's actually very interesting how this ecosystem has developed with large companies interacting with small biotech and academic centers, and then each playing to their strengths, where large companies, which obviously have the wherewithal to really put in place large phase 3 development programs, really have an interaction with smaller biotech and with academia, and where each really plays to their strengths to bring new drugs and new vaccines as well to patients. It's great to see that driven by oncology, rare disease as well, and now increasingly also infectious disease.
Yeah.
So both of you alluded to, and this term may have come across as two sides of a coin, Operation Warp Speed, and people have also asked on the chat and the question. On one hand, will the procedure of drug development or the new way be permanent? And the second is, will it be faster? And the term faster brings in its connotations of bypassing certain data points, endpoints, and even the emergency use authorization, while very relevant for the situation which, Paul, you alluded to, it was in relevance to the pandemic response. Yeah. Which elements of these would be sustainable in the future without giving the illusion of a compromise patient safety or patient paradigm, or at least the diligence that is necessary to go ahead? Ken, you alluded to a sharp reduction in the process for development of vaccine, but what happens with the others? How do we, as an industry, as academics, as the regulators, keep the morale of the patient community invested in this? Thoughts?
Well, the amount of R&D funding to do this work is finite. It's not as if you can put unlimited amount of R&D dollars into every disease state. So it's really goes back to what Paul was saying. It's a matter of priorities. Where is the priority? Where do you want to put your R&D efforts and activities? I think this is where government initiatives play a role, because they shift those priorities. They help shift those priorities. It's even less sometimes about the available funding that could be provided, like in the Operation Warp Speed, where there is funding available, and more about the public demand that's created by these government initiatives that industry focus on a particular disease area. And I think it helps to sort of rally support. And I go back to a case that in the United States and back in the mid-1970s, when Richard Nixon was the president, he declared war on cancer. And the war on cancer was going to lead to the elimination of cancer in our lifetimes. And the bottom line is, it was declared a failure because cancer continued and it wasn't dead. But what it did do is it changed priorities within the NIH as to where they were putting their grant dollars. And as more and more money went into oncology research, we are now benefiting from that. We are actually beginning to see the treatments available for cancers that had no treatments in the past. And that gets back to the basic research. But it also, I think, was stimulated and catalyzed by the fact that way back then, it caused a change in priorities about where we were going to put our research funding. And now we're benefiting by that, by this wealth of new targets, receptors, proteins, other things that we can attack on a cancer cell. If back in the 1970s, there was a war on dementia, I'm wondering now whether we would have a host of treatments for dementia, senile dementia, and Alzheimer's disease that we would have never, that we don't see now. Instead, we see cancer treatments. But the bottom line is the R&D bucket is finite. We can't put money into everything. It all comes down to priorities, and I think government helps to set those priorities.
Yeah, and it should happen in a collaborative fashion, right? With as I mentioned earlier, academia, industry, patient organizations as well, I think are important in this. There's another good example of this, right? Which is the Orphan Drug Act, right? So where before there were very, very few programs where we would develop drugs for rare diseases. Today, it's incredible the number of new drugs that is being developed, that are being developed for rare diseases, and the number of patients, and especially children, that benefit from them. So prioritization is very important, and of course, as a society, we need to be able to define and agree on those priorities, which in a number of countries seems to be increasingly difficult given the political situation. But nonetheless, I think it's important to do this. And my fear is that we were able to do this for the pandemic, but once the pandemic ebbs, which I hope is around the corner, but once the pandemic ebbs, it might be difficult to sustain that momentum. And I think it's important for us to all band together to ensure that, one, we learn from what we saw in the pandemic, but also that we continue that impetus that we had to really address, to really define our priorities very clearly and to address them as well.
So Paul, let me bring back to the question that was asked earlier. You alluded to quality, oversight, reliability of data, and probably the safety part, which is critical. How do we balance that with the perception of speed, putting these three elements into jeopardy? We've seen dozens of clinical trials being run. You alluded to some yourself. So the real world data generating real world insights leading to real world evidence. And between the data and the evidence, there's a gap. So how does one handle the potential challenges of this quality, reliability, and safety being compromised?
Yeah. So I think it's very important to focus on quality first. We should not, for any reasons of speed or urgent need, jeopardize the quality of what we're doing. Because in the end, if a trial is not run according to the principles of quality and reliability, what happens is that the result is not reliable. And so we would do patients a disservice by trying to go fast and trying to cut corners. And again, here, the pandemic, I think, really teaches us how to do this. It comes back again to priorities, to ensure that we focus on what we want to achieve and focus the whole of society really on solving the problem. And so one of the so there's a couple of things that were done, which we may consider in the future as well. One was that in many different organizations, industry included, there was really a focus on cutting red tape. And the things that normally took weeks and had a number of review committees associated with them were done much quicker. The clinical trials themselves were not necessarily that much faster. It is more what happens in between, and also what happens and also what happens in parallel versus in series. And so it was much more, I think, an effort of cutting or reviewing process flows rather than using less patients, relying on electronic health records, etc. EHR and real-world data are very important, and they're growing in importance and also in regulatory acceptance. And I think that's a very positive development. But in this particular case, they were still more supportive of what is eventually still the gold standard of evidence, the randomized controlled trial. You're on mute, Praveen.
Sorry, great point, thanks. And Julio is also questioning along the same lines. There are different processes in different countries, especially related to consent, related to local regulatory approvals, and these could be subject to variations in different markets. And how do we ensure that quality and oversight and globalization is maintained? A great point there. Ken, any thoughts on that part from your side?
I think that captures it all. I mean, I think that's an important aspect of the focus on quality. Without the quality, then there's really nothing. And we did see that. You brought up the hydroxychloroquine example. The data that were coming out were of low quality, and yet the early access to that information plus the panic mentality led to a lot of unnecessary safety problems, as well as people who probably died because they didn't get adequate treatment. So it's the quality could not be more important when it comes to these clinical trials.
Great one. And Paul also brought in the potential learnings to be able to apply in the future, which is cutting down on the tape, working in between, cutting down on the in between trials or in parallel to some activities. great learnings. One point that has also come up now, which is a challenge to, again, the whole concept of engagement from the patient's voice. You have an increasingly empowered patient group. You have a more learned patient audience. Now they're aware of what a clinical trial, what is phase 3, what is phase 4. How do we, in the future, ensure that we are able to get better engagement from these patients, bring the voice in, like the patient-focused drug development elements, bring the voice in earlier, given the learnings of the pandemic, where we see an engaged and audience and a community, patient community. Any thoughts on how we could better build on patient engagement and bring the patient voice into the fold? Paul? Sorry.
I'll just start off by saying I think that has really existed for a long time. Starting with the AIDS epidemic, where we really saw an activist patient group that began to work more closely with industry to identify some of the challenges that AIDS patients confronted. I think for long-term chronic diseases, those types of relationships already exist. Companies that are developing multiple sclerosis drugs most likely work very closely with the multiple sclerosis societies so that they, and Parkinson's and all the others. It's in these other disease areas, I think, where there's more of a challenge, where the patient groups may not be organized. The issue is, if you don't have an organized patient group, it's very difficult for industry to tap into that. So I think that's definitely a challenge. There was no organized COVID group. So it's not as if all of a sudden you could tap into the COVID organizations and start to work with them. It's really a matter of finding those groups that are organized, working with them as closely as possible. Patient engagement is the catchphrase of this year, certainly in the last few years as well. I think the idea that companies have to work with patients to understand what the needs are, what their challenges are, as well as what their priorities are in terms of treatment.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important, and you mentioned chronic disease, it's especially difficult to engage. Infectious disease is almost by definition acute, except in some diseases, but an acute disease, very difficult to talk to patients. Actually, what we've done is we've tried to focus on groups of patients that are particularly vulnerable to infectious disease. And so older adults, immunosuppressed patients, for instance, so that's a bit a way around it, but it is difficult. One thing that I wanted to also say about interactions with patients and actually the public in general, I think misinformation about COVID has killed, I think, more people than anything else in this pandemic. And so I think we definitely need a much better way of informing patients and informing the public in general about diseases, and so that has been, I think, a very clear issue here. And part of that actually is an increasing lack of credibility of institutions in general that we see in the world, and so difficult to address, but I think it's something that we need to think about and to work together again with academia and with government on how can we address that part of our pandemic preparedness.
Now, maybe this is an academic speaking, but I think of this as an issue of scientific literacy. And the answer to this goes back to elementary school and early education, where people understand that science is an iterative process. So if a scientist like a Fauci tells you that this is what we know now, it may not be what we know in 5 months. It may be different. And that doesn't mean that he was lying initially. It means that science evolves. And that has to do with scientific literacy. And I think that's something that needs to be stressed even more than it is now at the early education levels.
Great.
I couldn't agree more. Scientific literacy and health literacy, I think, are two important issues that need to be addressed.
Great point. And Sander from Australia is also questioning the role of the government. And you've also seen how politics has been pitched with science. And you used a gentle word, Paul, in your inimitable style about misinformation. I think there's more disinformation going around, and that's something that we really need to be able to counter going forward. I know we are coming close to the hour, and this has engendered significant discussion and probably thought-provoking as well. And while this conversation has also raised in very simple terms about how we are going forward with this, it also offers hope. With good science, good policy, and good business practices shall see us through these tumultuous times. So it only remains for me to thank the panelists, Ken, Paul, for transforming this vulnerability to strength and inspiration. I have to thank the operations team for providing the perfect platform and the thoroughly engaged audience, not only around the world here, but who have also brought in their voices into the conversation. So on that optimistic note, with hope for the future, which both Paul, you, and Ken have shared, we're going to set the ball for rolling for another day, and all of you have a wonderful rest of the day everywhere. Many thanks for joining us on this critical discussion.
Thank you, Pravin.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Paul.
Stay well, and many thanks.